also tend to go beyond making these immediate inferences of people's expressions, and often read into inferences on more stable dispositions that they have, such as their personality traits or characteristics of the individual. And it's worth paying attention to that there's a bit of a history that exists within cultures of trying to ascribe or make inferences from the shapes of people's faces. And you might hear the saying that kind of the face is a window to a person's soul. And although you get these kind of specific beliefs that would vary from culture to culture, a lot of them have all shared this general assumption that there is a direct correspondence between the facial features that someone has and the personality characteristics that they express. So this kind of assumption would have reached its sort of prominence back in the sort of early 18th, 19th century. One example here is an article by a Swiss pastor who's kind of loosely credited with the idea of spreading physiognomy. So in other words, the art of reading personality in faces. And in these cases, you would have, here is a very polite demonstration. All very broad-headed humans, animals, birds, reptiles and flies are vicious. Very narrow-headed men and snakes are harmless. So you're looking just at the kind of broadness and the narrowness of the head is ascribing a personality characteristic to these individuals. Another example would be, this face presents a most hateful character. Craft, sordid avarice and hardened villainy have disfigured it and distorted the eyes and mouth. None of its muscles or features is expressive of benevolence or sensibility. The scoundrel might always be recognized in these lineaments. So, pretty strong words just based on his face. According to Aristotle's opinion on physiognomy, he whose nose is curved from the root of the forehead and strongly marked like the beak of an eagle must be a brave man. It was also observed by Polemon and Adamantius that such a nose denotes courage. So you've got kind of courage and bravery just coming from the shape of somebody's nose. More examples. Forehead of an unintelligent man, the forehead of an imbecile and long-lived man, the forehead of an adventurer, much rather that than the previous two, and the forehead of a poet and a musician in the bottom right that's on here. I think one of my favourite examples was the fact that Charles Darwin nearly didn't make it onto the Beagle. So one of the most famous voyages that he did, where he went to the Galapagos Islands, he went to speak to the captain of the ship, who was a guy called Fitzroy at the time. Fitzroy was convinced that he could judge a man's character by the outline of his features, and he doubted whether anyone with my nose could possess sufficient energy and determination for the voyage. But I think he was afterwards well satisfied that my nose had spoken false. So really kind of strong beliefs in the fact that these facial features are giving you an insight into someone's characteristics. And you can still see this with the certain kind of stereotypical features that if you look at villains in a movie, a lot of them will kind of share similar characteristics. Now, when it comes to science and psychology, these ideas have been investigated and pretty rightly discarded. So it isn't the case that having a particular kind of beak-shaped nose makes you excessively brave. If that was the case, you could have some plastic surgery and it would change your level of braveness, and that seems downright absurd. But in a way, they kind of were onto something. So rather than it being an actual fact that these features lead to traits, we do still regularly attribute characteristics based upon people's facial features. And the impressive thing is the consistency in judgments about faces. So groups of people are consistent and confident that they can tell whether somebody is kind or nice or looks untrustworthy. So for example, if you were to imagine walking into a party and the first two faces that you see when you walk into this room are presented on the image here, who would you choose to approach out of these two? And I think 99% of you would probably want to approach the person on the left. You would think that's a happy person, that's a warm, inviting, whereas the person on the right looks a little bit more neurotic or anxious, or just kind of introverted and a little bit potentially depressed. And if you think about the attributions you might make about people based on their facial features, you might list off a number of different traits. For example, some of the ones that I mentioned before was inferring how kind they are, how extroverted, or how cunning you think they are. However, it turns out research in the last decade or so has indicated that there's two dimensions that appear to be particularly relevant in our judgments, and these are trustworthiness or warmth and dominance, or you can think of this as a level of competence. So if we think of trustworthiness or warmth, this relates to aspects of the perceived intention to harm. It is anchored on the emotion of happiness versus anger. And activation in the amygdala plays a key role in this assessment. So if you have a high reaction in the amygdala, we're perhaps unlikely to perceive this person as being particularly warm or trustworthy. Dominance, in turn, refers to our perceptions or inference on someone's ability to carry out their intentions. It anchors on perceptions of strength. It's related to age, their gender, power dominance versus submission, immaturity, and femininity. So in other words, the more masculine, male, powerful, mature, and older somebody is perceived to be, the more dominant and competent we see them as. Okay, so it turns out that we can make a lot of these attributions about other people by looking at very subtle differences in their facial features. So in the research that was done here by Alexander Todorov and colleagues, what they would do is take a single kind of neutral average face that has been computer generated, and then they would morph this to introduce subtle differences in aspects of the face to essentially characterize individuals that would vary according to their trustworthiness and dominance. So one of the problems, if you're trying to understand what features influence our attributions, is that there are really kind of hundreds of things that are out there. So we need to use these computer-generated models so that we can explicitly manipulate certain characteristics to see how they affect a specific judgment. So in this case, researchers realized that there's certain features that tend to appear untrustworthy. So, for example, on the left-hand side, having a low inner eyebrow, the deepness of the indentation, shallow cheekbones, and a thin chin. Each of those individually contribute towards lower ratings of trustworthiness or someone being perceived as more untrustworthy. So this varies along this kind of x-axis at the bottom, least trustworthy, most trustworthy. Whereas you can see the variation in terms of dominance. Somebody who is least dominant down here has a very kind of wide face and is particularly short, whereas the more dominant the face is, we've got this kind of thin, tall face that appears, and a very kind of masculine face that's on there. So there's other unique characteristics that are associated with dominance as well. So we're tending to take these clues and then make an inference along these two key dimensions. And these seem to be more important than any other dimensions that we look at or think about. So you may also see some other attributions, slightly more specific ones, such as some people we consider to have a baby face. And from a ecological perspective, you do find that there is a kind of natural covariation that occurs between baby-like features and actual age. So we tend to assume that somebody who has a baby face would appear to be younger than they actually are. And we also associate, by default, baby-faced appearance with a greater sense of physical weakness, more naivety, submissiveness, honestness, kindness, and warmth. And the kind of things that associate or related to having a baby-faced appearance is this presence of relatively large eyes. You'd have a larger forehead, a kind of more short, snubby nose, and also a larger ratio of the cranium to the chin. So large region up here and very small chin. Okay, so what other factors seem to be important when we're making these inferences? It turns out one thing is the typicality of the face. So if you think of kind of the most normal, the most typical configuration of a face, so the kind of average height to width ratio, the further that you start to move away from this, the less that we tend to trust people. We also naturally tend to trust members of our own social category more. So if you're a white Caucasian male, then seeing faces that have the same characteristics tend to automatically lead to higher levels of trust judgments. And we seem to trust people with whom we share a resemblance. So again, you can examine this by presenting people with kind of manipulated images, and you ask them, so you can morph the face to share some of the characteristics of the participant, and people tend to be more trusting or more likely to rate the person that shares these similar features as more trustworthy. You can always also see this with attraction ratings. So there's been some experiments where, as I just explained, you would morph. So you might take if you're a male participant, you could take images of females and manipulate certain characteristics that they have so that you move them either closer or further away from sharing the same features as the participant. And then ask them which of these different images of a female face are you more attracted to. And generally you tend to find an effect that people are attracted to members of the other sex that share similar features. Now, what about the consequences of our attributions? And it turns out that they are not trivial. So one of the kind of strongest effects is the idea in leadership that individuals who have these facial configurations or facial structures that make them look more dominant and competent, they actually tend to be hired more frequently. And there's also a correlation or association between the amount of dominance that they show in their facial features and how much they are paid. Now, despite them being paid more money and given better roles, there is no evidence or no relationship that they actually perform any better. Similarly, you get evidence with cadet military ranking can be predicted by how dominant an individual looks. That would be a fascinating study to look at within Thai culture, I think. Another instance where our inferences lead to consequences is in strategic economic decisions that we might make. So in everyday real life, a lot of the time you are interacting with other people and you need to trust them. They will make promises and assurances to you. So how do these facial features influence whether we trust people or not in these sort of decision-making environments? And it turns out, as you would expect, that people tend to trust someone less who has a untrustworthy looking face. Now, that's kind of to be expected. The key thing here, though, is that this inference that we're making from faces even overrides the knowledge that we might have of their current and past behavior. It's also the case that our perceptions of competence can have a really strong influence in very important domains where you think we might actually prioritize external information more strongly. So when it comes to electing or voting for members of political parties, then there's evidence that perceptions of competence will lead to an increased likelihood of that person being elected, irrespective of the political party that they belong to or the kind of policies that they hold. So to study this, one of the ways that Alexander Todorov in his lab have done this is they took pairs of photos for individuals who were competing to be elected in nominations. So people were going to vote for these members of political parties across different states, and they asked individuals who had no awareness of who these two faces represented. So they had no knowledge of the policies or recognizing who these were. They'd never seen them before, and simply asked these people to rate how competent this person appears based on their photo. So no other information that's here. And then they looked at what's the difference in the votes between these two individuals. And you find a relatively modest correlation between how competent people perceive this person to be and the amount of votes that they received. I think even more remarkably, you have facial features can also influence sentencing in the courtroom. So there's evidence that harsher sentences are given to people with more untrustworthy faces. There's also high convictions when defendants fit stereotypes of the crime that they're being tried for. So in this case, Dumas and Benoit test, they presented participants with a series of case studies and asked them to select a photograph of a defendant whom they felt best fitted the crime. So if you've got some kind of strong murder crime, then you might take a stereotypical image of someone who's looking a little bit villainous and probably quite dominant and strong. And they found a significant correlation between certain photographs and certain crimes. They then presented case descriptions of the crimes along with the correlating photograph, and asked another set of participants to rate the guilt of the defendant for that particular crime. And they found that certain defendants tended to be found more guilty for certain crimes. So their research appeared to suggest that certain faces are more associated with and therefore thought to be more likely to be guilty of certain crimes. Another bit of evidence suggests that Afrocentric facial features lead to harsher sentences. So this is work that's done in America, even after you're controlling for the racial categorization or the ethnicity of the person. So to study this, Blair et al. Looked at the photographs of individuals who'd been sentenced for criminal offences. And their analysis of a random sample of these inmate records showed that black and white inmates, if they've had equivalent criminal histories, they would receive roughly equivalent sentences. However, within each race, so within whites and blacks, it was the inmates with the more Afrocentric features that tended to receive harsher sentences than those within their category with less Afrocentric features. And you find that these results are consistent with laboratory findings and do suggest that although racial stereotyping as a function of the category, so as a function of whether you're black or white, has generally been removed from sentencing decisions. So it might be the case that if somebody is making a sentencing judgment, they are explicitly, consciously aware of the potential of some racial bias. However, there is still some stereotyping that's occurring based on these facial features in probably a lot more of a kind of unconscious, implicit way. So if aspects of our facial features are this important and others are making inferences about our trustworthiness and our dominance. One really important question is can we do anything about our appearance? Can we influence how others might be perceiving us? And there's some good and bad news on this. It is possible to make yourself look more trustworthy, but it isn't possible to look more competent. And the reason for this is that trustworthiness is generally conveyed by cues that are relatively dynamic. So aspects of our face that might be changing or prone to change. So it can relate to aspects of our eyebrows and whether we've got a kind of upward curving mouth. So you can change whether it's using aspects of makeup could do this as well, or just changing the natural expression that you tend to have. Whereas perceptions of competence or dominance seem to be based on much more static cues or aspects. So this is looking at the width of facial features that you have, which you can't really do much to manipulate or change. Okay, so what factors might explain why we have this apparent relationship between facial features and personal characteristics? And really there's kind of three possible explanations for this. The first is that people's appearance might in some way produce different sorts of behaviors. So there's evidence that extroverts are often perceived to be more attractive. It's also the case that attractive people are more rewarded for being outgoing. So if you're attractive and you go out to a social setting, there's much more people that tend to pay you attention, to give you compliments. So therefore it could be the fact that extroversion in some sense is an effect of an individual's appearance. So this continual reward that you have for being in social settings because you're attractive makes it more likely that you have extroverted personality characteristics. So that's one possibility. It's also the case that aspects of behavior might produce indirectly our appearance. So for example, if you're very neurotic or anxious concerned person, then you might habitually frown. And this is something that might cause stable changes in, for example, the posture of the brow that would make a person look either more neurotic or less agreeable. So some kind of direct influence of our regular behavior. An alternative is that a third factor could cause both appearance and behavior. So you have hormones such as testosterone. This is something that can influence both our facial appearance. So you tend to find with testosterone that there's differences in the height-width ratio of faces. So it's influencing facial features, but it also has an effect on behaviors. So it leads to increased risk-taking and a much more kind of outgoing disposition that's there. However, it seems to be the case that despite the consistency of our judgments and the convictions of our beliefs, there is actually very little evidence that facial features are capable of predicting traits. So in the absence of clear emotional cues that are broadcasting the intentions of a person, faces are instead evaluated in terms of their similarity to expressions of, for example, anger and happiness. And this is based on our kind of automatic disposition to understand what emotional state somebody is in order to understand their intentions. And people infer not only these intentions, but also the capability of them acting out on these intentions. So therefore, it seems to be the case that faces are evaluated based on facial maturity in an attempt to infer this ability. So it seems to be the case that when we're making these inferences, what we're really doing is taking a momentary aspect or momentary features of the face that would typically be processed to understand their expression, And we're extrapolating these temporary states to infer long-term stable traits or attributions of people. So, to put this in Todorov's words, our snap judgments of faces are based on an overgeneralization of an evolved need to read facial expressions for signs of danger.